You are listening to RudolfSteinerAudio.com. As well, you can hear these podcasts at RudolfSteiner.podbean.com. Please consider becoming a patron. There are two publishing houses, SteinerBooks.org in America and RudolfSteinerPress.com in England, which are the sole publishers of Steiner into English and have given me permission to do these recordings. Please consider patronizing them as well. This is a reading of Collected Works, Volume 62 by Rudolf Steiner, 14 lectures, entitled Results of Spiritual Research, translated by Simon Blaxland de Lange. This is Lecture 1, given in Berlin on the 31st of October, 1912, and it is entitled, How is Spiritual Science Refuted? As in previous winters, it has been made possible for me to give a number of lectures about spiritual science here at this place in the course of the winter season. It will be apparent from the program that the initial purpose of these lectures is to encompass what spiritual science has to say from its standpoint about the question of life. That the transition will then be made to shedding light on some important cultural phenomena and issues, and on outstanding figures, such as Raphael and Leonardo da Vinci. And that finally something will be said regarding the relationship of spiritual science to a number of matters concerning the intellectual life of our present times. These lectures will be inaugurated today in a quite distinctive way. The intention is to present at the outset not what can be said by way of consolidating and strengthening this spiritual research, but on the contrary, what possible objections of a more significant nature can be brought to bear against it. It lies in the nature of things that because of circumstances peculiar to our present times, and because of several other factors, this spiritual research attracts much hostility. But nothing would be more inappropriate to this spiritual research than if it were to succumb to fanaticism, and so to speak, only wanted to see what can be adduced on its behalf from the standpoint of its representatives. Fanaticism must, and we shall see the reasons why this is said, lie far removed from this spiritual research. Therefore it must, more than is perhaps necessary in any other case, give thought to understanding the objections of its opponents, and indeed it must tolerate them up to a certain point. And it must come to understand that a whole number of thoroughly worthy present-day seekers after truth are not able to ally themselves with it. It has been my custom, those who have attended previous lectures will know this, and this custom will be continued in subsequent ones, at the same time to consider possible objections to any statements that I may make. I shall today anticipate some of the more significant and weighty objections. For objections against what can be said from the standpoint of spiritual research indeed emerge not merely from opponents, but in any conscientiously undertaken spiritual research, a person who has engaged in such an endeavor himself feels that at every moment he is presented with these possible objections. Moreover, because the truths of spiritual research must be attained and struggled for within the soul, there is a sense in which one has also developed a counterweight to such objections as may have occurred to one, and there are distinct advantages in being clear in advance about anything that may be open to objection. I do not consider it to be my task to enter here into those objections or alleged criticisms that can, so to speak, be found on the street or are the product of sheer fantasy, but rather to take account of the objections which anyone in our time who is sincerely seeking truth can himself make out of the spiritual foundations of our present age, and even to a certain extent must make. I shall also not concern myself with much that is often referred to today as spiritual research or theosophy, for it has to be admitted from the outset that what appears today as theosophy is not really something to celebrate. However, what has been and will be presented here shall indeed be taken into account in the objections that I shall consider today. But if we are wanting to involve ourselves in such objections, Much of what has been said in the course of the previous cycles, and will come to expression in the coming lectures, will need to be drawn upon, at least in outline. We shall therefore briefly call to mind what is meant here by spiritual research, as regards its content and its sources. To begin with, spiritual science can in general be characterized by saying that it is based upon the standpoint that it must reach beyond everything that a person may perceive through his senses, and is able to discover by means of a science that is founded primarily upon the senses, and on a reasoning power that draws its conclusions from the senses. 2, the spiritual causes of what can be apprehended by the senses and investigated by the intellect, so that everywhere behind these sense-perceptible phenomena, it does not only acknowledge, but endeavors to prove the existence of a spiritual world in which there reside the causes of everything that the senses can perceive and the intellect can study. This spiritual science can be distinguished from many other spiritual disciplines of both past and present through the fact that it does not merely seek to assert in a general hypothetical way that there is a spiritual world beyond the senses and the ordinary faculties of understanding, but proceeds on the basis that man is capable of developing his cognitive powers and soul forces in such a way that they can gain insight into a spiritual world, which they could not achieve without this development. Hence, not only the possibility of a spiritual world, but the knowledgeability of such a world is the distinctive quality of this spiritual research, or anthroposophy, if that is what we wish to call it. That with the particular nature of the soul forces and cognitive powers that people ordinarily possess, if we may put it thus, it would not be possible to penetrate into the spiritual world is something that can be acknowledged from the start. But to claim that these cognitive powers cannot be developed in such a way that once they had been raised to this higher standpoint, they would be just as capable of perceiving the spiritual world as eyes are in perceiving the world of the senses, is disputed by spiritual science. With this, we have already arrived at the sources of this spiritual research. These sources become available to the soul when through inner work, through inner development, and I have often spoken here about the methods of this inner development, it raises itself to a higher vantage point as regards its perception. Then, in apposition to the sense world that surrounds us, spiritual science makes manifest another spiritual world, from whence the true causes of all sensory phenomena originate. By investigating the spiritual world, we come to regard man as a far more complicated being than he is for ordinary sensory or narrowly intellectual perception. We come to see man as a four-membered being. That which one calls the physical body is regarded by spiritual research only as part of the whole of man's being. The ordinary life of the senses can observe this physical body. The reasoning faculties can understand it. This sensory body is the object of ordinary science. For a large part of our modern experience, the physical body is the totality of man's being. For spiritual scientific research, it is only one part out of four members of this human nature. In addition to this physical body, spiritual research distinguishes the so-called etheric body or life body, which is incorporated in the physical body. But it does not speak of this etheric body or life body as though it were accessible only to the intellect, but in such a way that the developed soul forces are capable of beholding it, just as a developed eye, EYE, can perceive the colors blue or red, whereas a colorblind eye is unable to perceive these colors. And it then speaks of the necessary conclusion that occurs, namely that the physical body naturally disintegrates with death through the forces that are specific to it, because the forces that belong to the physical body bring about its decomposition, its disintegration, and are only held together because during the time of life between birth and death, the etheric body or life body, which fights continuously against the disintegration of the physical body, is incorporated in it. Only when the separation from the etheric body occurs, with the moment of death, does the physical body proceed in accordance with its own forces, which then, because they work in their particular fashion, bring about its decomposition. Man has his physical body in common with the whole mineral, lifeless world. He has his etheric body in association with all living things, with the whole of the plant world. However, spiritual science does not stop there. It recognizes a third member of human nature, which is as independent as the physical body. We do not need to stumble over particular terms. They will be explained and have already been partially explained. It is the astral body that is distinguished as the third member. This is the real bearer of passions, desires, impulses, emotions, hence of everything that we call our soul body, which unfolds its activity in our inner being. And in spiritual research, we again distinguish from this astral body the actual bearer of the ego. Whereas man has the astral body in common with everything that can develop emotions and passions and an inner life of ideas, as exists, for example, in the animal world, he has the fourth member of his being, the bearer of the ego, as the crown of his personal nature in his own right. For spiritual research, man's being consists initially of the physical body, the etheric body, the astral body, and the bearer of the ego. It further transpires, for anyone who is able to gain insight into the spiritual world, that a large part of the life's circumstances to which we are subjected is distinguished from ordinary life, namely the time that we spend asleep. Sleep is distinguished for the spirit researcher from waking life, in that when someone is asleep, the bearer of his ego and his astral body are separated from his etheric body and physical body. The two latter members remain in bed as a plant-like form, while the bearer of the ego, together with the astral body, its emotions, impulses, capacities for forming ideas, and so forth, withdraw from the physical and etheric bodies during sleep, and then develop a life of their own in a self-subsisting spiritual world. For a normal person today, however, ordinary life is impossible when the ego and astral body are thus in a withdrawn state during sleep. Because they have no organs with which to perceive their surroundings, they do not have eyes and ears as does the physical body. Thus it is impossible that the astral body and ego perceive the world in which they find themselves. The higher development of the soul consists precisely in that the astral body and ego become capable of developing organs in order to perceive their environment, and that a state can thereby arise for the spirit researcher in which he perceives the spiritual world. Thus, in addition to the waking state and the state of sleep, he also has a waking state of sleep, if we may refer to it in this way, which is that condition whereby the spirit researcher can perceive the spiritual world to which man owes his true origin. Thus, spiritual science tries to explain from spiritual facts the transition that a person makes every 24 hours between waking and sleeping. A further aspect of spiritual science is that it approaches the great riddle of death and life. That is, in other words, the question that so stirs the human heart, the question of man's immortality. Spiritual science comes to the realization that man's true spiritual being is not merely a result of his physical organization, but an independent entity and essence belonging to a spiritual world which builds up the physical body, which exists before birth, indeed before conception, and from the first moment that a human individual enters into existence as a germinal cell, works as an upbuilding force upon his organism. This is, in other words, the soul's spiritual essence, the truly active and upbuilding force that brings to a person an organizing principle for his entire life, that bears only the fruits of his life's experiences through the gate of death, and makes with death the transition to a spiritual world, in order then to have further experiences, and which then organizes a new physical body for a further life in order to undergo a new life and to repeat the cycle. Spiritual science speaks, in other words, of repeated earth lives. It speaks of repeated earthly lives in such a way that we look back from our present embodiment within sensory existence to other incarnations in the past, but also look into the future to subsequent incarnations of our essential being. Thus we divide the entirety of human life into a life between birth and death and another life, which for the senses and the ordinary reasoning powers takes its course purely spiritually between death and the next birth. But spiritual science conceives of this not in an eternally recurring way, but such that it recognizes these repeated earthly lives to be only intermediate states, whereas the entirety of human life goes back to a primordial spiritual source which preceded all life, the whole of planetary existence, so that earthly lives had their beginning in a condition where man emerged from a purely spiritual existence, and that once the necessary conditions have been fulfilled, he will enter again into purely spiritual states, which will include the fruits of everything that he has undergone through a succession of earthly lives. This is, to be sure, only an outline, which will be filled out in the coming lectures with distinctive colors, but which is able to show the kind of results that spiritual scientific research can obtain. If we place this whole tableau before our minds, we must indeed say that such a picture will, to a large number of those who reckon to be able to think today, not merely be incomprehensible and incapable of proof, but even something that can call forth irony, scorn, and derision. Already, when there is any reference to spiritual science, anyone who wants to relate everything that is of importance to him today to the sure foundation of science must say to himself, what is the significance to such research of not only all the various achievements of science, but also its methods? Of what significance to spiritual science are the seriousness, the worthiness, the exactitude, and also the great efforts that science has made in recent centuries and decades in order to arrive at an objective certainty. Spiritual science does not, of course, want to work against science. This has frequently been emphasized, but to be fully in harmony with it. It must therefore be conscious of the objections that science has against it, not only with respect to its content, but also bearing in mind especially the seriousness and achievements of science in recent centuries. It would be true to say that according to spiritual science, the sources of spiritual research lie in a certain development of the soul, in that the soul engages in certain inner processes of ideation, feeling, and will, which one may call meditation, so that it has, as a result, inner experiences that are naturally limited purely to one's own soul, and that no one can verify other than the person who experiences them. And then something of this unverifiable nature is presented as a scientific statement regarding the spiritual worlds. What, science can say, then remains of what is the most wonderful achievement of this science? That through all the research of recent centuries, only that which can be verified everywhere and at any time by every human being objectively has validity. Experiments, outward observations, have the distinctive quality that anyone can directly relate to them. This is not so with what is sought and struggled for in one's inner being. If one looks at people who have an inner experience of such things, does not the whole uncertain nature of the contradictory things they say in all their great variety show how little the experiences that a mystically intensified consciousness is able to bestow accord with one another? Surely we must harmonize the research that various individuals are undertaking in the clinic, in the laboratory, or somewhere similar. The response will be that this could not be done any differently, so that what someone experiences subjectively shows itself to be unscientific through the fact that it cannot be verified by another person, since this other person cannot look into the soul of the spirit researcher concerned. Do not these experiences of the soul have, one might say, a total similarity with everything that is very evidently experienced in the soul as a result of illness, overexertion, and ecstasy? If the spirit researcher protests that he has absolutely no intention of allowing any arbitrary vision that appears before his soul to count as the result of his research, and that he proceeds in accordance with specific methods, someone can, nevertheless, still object. And this objection appears thoroughly justified. Yes, is it not so that whenever people experience visions, hallucinations, and so forth, and have the kind of soul state that makes this possible, they develop a much greater belief in their fixed ideas, in their hallucinations and visions, than in what their senses persuade them to think? If one looks at a dreamer who is rigid and unbending in his beliefs, one will have cause to be concerned about what the spirit researcher wants to draw forth from the depths of his soul as something that is not an illusion, that has objective existence in the spiritual world. Someone might say that it is possible for it to have objective existence in the spiritual world, but against the validity of such a soul experiment, it must be said that the dreamer has just as much confidence in his illusory ideas as the spirit researcher in the results of his research, which he owes to what comes forth from the depths of his soul. Only someone who has not followed the development of the objective research of what may be said to be the soundly based science of the last few centuries and decades can pass over such an objection with a smile. It is weightier than one ordinarily thinks for those who approach their spiritual scientific results from a one-sided direction. It must be said, for example, with regard to what is said in my book titled Knowledge of the Higher Worlds, where particular instructions are given for the individual soul, that when the soul is completely involved with such an experience, it has no means of keeping itself in check. All this testifies to the fact that one must take very seriously such an objection, which to a superficial spirit researcher may even appear trivial. There is so much that can be said about the nature of what could be described as erroneous ideas, which could also be used against spiritual science, in that people say, everything that you present as methods for developing the soul may be nothing other than a refined capacity for having illusions and hallucinations. Then spiritual science appears particularly out of place with respect to serious, verifiable science when it refers to specific, isolated results. A conscientious seeker after truth of the present, who is familiar with developments of recent years, might say, do you not know anything about everything that happened before? You speak of an etheric body or life body that is supposed to have an existence independent from the physical body. Do you know nothing about what used to be called a life force that lurked in people's minds until the 19th century? And that the belief in this life force has finally been disposed of through devoted scientific efforts. And are you ignorant of the following fact? It used to be said in earlier centuries that a chemical process occurred in lifeless nature between separate chemical substances. But when, so it was claimed, this same connection between substances enters the human organism, the so-called life force takes hold of it. Then the process that takes place among the individual substances would not be what we learn in chemistry and physics, but these various substances work upon one another under the influence of the life force. It was a great step forward that this life force has been swept overboard, that people sought to say that this life force is of no help whatsoever, and that one's endeavor must be that what one can investigate in the lifeless world must be pursued further in the living organism, that one would need merely to take into account the more complex way in which substances interact there, rather than resort to the dubious expedient of the life force. The life force was indeed disposed of as such a dubious expedient of science, in that it was shown how the efficacy of certain substances that would formerly be conceived of only under the influence of the life force is also brought about in the laboratory. And because that is not yet the end of the matter, science had to set itself the high ideal of considering also that combination of substances as exists in the cell of the plant, and had to avoid resorting to the dubious expedient of a life force when it came to investigating how substances and forces are active in the organism. So long as people were not in a position to give rise to combinations of substances in the laboratory, it was justified to say that they came about only if the individual substances were influenced by the life force. But since it has become possible, especially through Liebig and Wöhler, after which there has no longer been a belief in the life force, to think of certain substances without the life force, it must, since then, be said that also the more complicated constructions and interactions in the human organism do not any longer require the help of a special life force. Thus, in the course of the 19th century, science embraced the high ideal that most researchers adhered to, even if there were also, quote, neo-vitalists, close quote, the ideal that became a reality, to recognize such connections between substances as they interact in the living organism, and without calling upon the help of a nebulous, mystical life force, which, as all serious scientific research of the 19th century has always maintained, serves absolutely no purpose, because it contributes nothing whatsoever to the objective knowledge of nature. Anyone who acknowledges these facts, and above all takes into account the seriousness and intrinsic worthiness that underlie these developments in science, may well protest. Is it really so that a number of people have appeared as so-called spirit researchers who are again reviving the old life force in the form of their etheric body or life body? Is it not a sign of scientific dilettantism? These people who know nothing of the ideal of science, may, quote, have their beliefs, close quote. But the scientific researcher himself cannot be taken in by what can well appear to be a mere revival of the idea of the life force. Thus, spiritual science, one can say, works in a dilettantish way by failing to take account of everything that belongs to the most beautiful ideals of modern science. And it merely makes use of the circumstance that science has not yet managed to manufacture in the laboratory certain substances that are to be found in the living organism, in order to be able to maintain that a special etheric body or life body is necessary for the engendering of life. One might add that as science develops further, it will eradicate this etheric body or life body from man's being. So long as science has not yet succeeded in the course of its triumphant progress in showing that there is no such thing as an etheric body, and that the combination of the substances of the living organism can also be engendered in a test tube, the theosophists or spiritual researchers can make a song and dance about the etheric body, which is nothing but a resuscitation of the old life force. This is the sort of reproach that might be leveled against dilettantism when it arises. If, now, spiritual science says regarding sleep life that the emotions, impulses, and desires that people have and are associated with what is specifically designated as the astral body, and that when a person is overcome by sleep, it leaves the physical and etheric bodies and leads an independent existence, the criticism can be made that it is very easy to speak of an inner soul life if one simplifies everything by referring to this inner soul life without all the difficulties and riddles of which science is aware, by saying this is the astral body and all that takes place internally has a connection with it. Again, one can address the advances that science has made and say, what are the great advances that have been made, especially in recent decades, in order to explain purely scientifically a phenomenon such as sleep life or dream life? It would take a long time if I were to present to you all the efforts of science, which are to be thoroughly regarded with seriousness and respect, to explain sleep life and the life of dreams. It would take a particularly long time, because in recent times a considerable amount of research has come to light, which could well be discussed. It will suffice to consider one aspect, which can show how difficult it becomes for a serious truth seeker at the present time to profess allegiance to what can initially appear as a mere assertion. The ego and the astral body of man withdraw from the physical body and etheric body when one goes to sleep. If we gather together a number of different hypotheses and conjectures about sleep life, and arrive at an overall explanation of it, we arrive at something of this kind. It is said that in order to give a thorough explanation, all that is needed is to look without prejudice at the phenomena of the human and animal organism. It becomes apparent that waking life consists in that the phenomena of the surrounding world make an impression upon the sense organs, that they stimulate the brain. They exert such stimuli throughout the day. How do they work upon man's brain and nervous system? They do so in such a way that they destroy the substance of which the nervous system consists. What is going on the whole day, according to modern natural science, is that the outward colors, sounds, and so on are penetrating our soul, that is, the life of our brain. By this means, dissimilation processes are brought about, that is to say, processes of destruction. Certain products are deposited. So long as these processes are taking place, man is not in a position to bring about the opposite process, that of the rebuilding of his organism. Thus, every time after we wake up, our inner life of soul is to a certain extent destroyed, so that by the time we have become tired, we have arrived at the point where we have destroyed our organism and it can no longer develop an inner soul life. It comes to a halt. One needs only to acknowledge the wearing out of the organic substance, that the organic substance is for a certain time no longer capable of maintaining these inner processes. Outward stimuli no longer have any effect. And the consequence is that the inner organism now begins to develop its nutritional processes, the opposite of the dissimilation or catabolic processes, the processes of assimilation, that it now restores the destroyed organic substance and thereby causes nocturnal sleep. Once the organic substance is restored, the inner soul life is also restored, and so waking life can cause fresh stimuli to arise until again tiredness ensues. Thus one is dealing with what we may call a self-regulation or self-renewal of the organism. It may be added that a conscientious seeker after truth, who is familiar with the results of modern science, will be bound to say, if waking life and sleep life, in their rhythmic alternation, can be well explained by the self-regulation or self-renewal of the organism, it is not only superfluous, but directly harmful if you restrict the progress of such a human science by saying that it is not a matter of self-regulation or self-renewal, but because man has an existence that is independent from it, something goes forth from the organism. Since it can be explained solely through the organism that the alternation between sleep and waking comes about, it is unnecessary and harmful to accept that consciousness is anything special, and withdraws from the organism in order during the night to engage in life of a particular kind. It will also be pointed out that spiritual science is characterized by extreme dilettantism, in which only such people believe who do not themselves know the path of science to explain the organism purely on its own terms. When the independence of intellectual life is spoken of, when it is said, and it seems a plausible thing to say, that intellectual life is independent, that through our senses we know of the human organism as a physical entity and can investigate it through scientific methods, as we would any other physical process, whereas there is still such a thing as intellectual or mental life, this is something that has often been emphasized, for example by Dubois-Reymond and also by others who would not readily profess materialism. One can, for instance, consider a conception of the brain. If one were to think of the human brain as so expanded, Leibniz has remarked on this, that one could walk through it, one would only see material processes within it. Intellectual life does, however, have something distinctive about it, and this testifies to the fact that one is dealing here with an intellectual life that is separate from the processes of physical life. Whether this is justified can, however, be shown from what Benedict says. The fact of consciousness is an actual fact of no other order than that of the working of the force of gravity in connection with matter. For we see, for example, the physical matter of a cosmic body. According to physical science, physical matter exerts a gravitational pull, and then there is something that is attracted, for example, by the sun. People formerly spoke of a supersensible aspect to such influences between the sun and the earth or moon. But this is merely equivalent to there being a piece of soft iron and an electrical or magnetic force inside it. And if we envisage the brain and its interplay of ideas, passions, emotions, and so forth, this is similar to the fact that gravity and other forces exert their influence around the material earth. Why then should there be an influence of a different nature if processes are influencing the brain that manifest themselves as does the force of gravity around the material earth? The earth, in its connection with gravity and with whatever else invisibly influences it, is no different from what influences the brain in the form of emotions, ideas, and other processes. How does one have a right, it might well be asked, to speak of an independence of mental life if one does not allow oneself to speak of the force of gravity being exercised also when there is no body for it to attract? And one can say, furthermore, just as one has no right to speak of a cosmic body exerting a gravitational force in a situation where there is a free cosmic space, so one is not entitled to speak of a distinctive soul quality that is not bound through a brain to material existence. It should be clear to every serious seeker after truth that one should not be allowed to disregard such things through an unscientific fanaticism. If weighty objections can be raised against the spiritual scientific understanding of sleep and waking life, and against the independence of consciousness in general, how can someone who takes the scientific methods of the present seriously, find a way of agreeing with what is said by spiritual science about repeated earthly lives, about the existence of a core of human nature that transcends death, that has experiences in the time between death and a new birth, and then reappears in a forthcoming physical earthly life. Here an objection is made not only by those who are reliant on scientific facts, but also by those who want themselves to be, in many respects, spiritual scientists, by psychologists, by the present-day investigators of the soul. The question is asked, what is the necessary sign that the human essence continues in existence? The soul researcher of the present can find this quite simply in that human consciousness has a memory of the states that it underwent during life. Continuation, continuity of consciousness, is what psychologists currently take into consideration. They cannot become involved in what does not figure in the consciousness of the human personality, and they will always have to refer to the fact that a person does indeed have a memory of particular circumstances in his life between birth and death, but can find no comparable evidence of the continuing existence of the human essence that may have issued from previous earthly lives. Many serious-minded, present-day seekers after truth will also have understandable objections with respect to many other things that have been said in the course of these series of lectures. Thus they may say, you can indeed adduce that certain things in human life seemingly cannot be explained from the events of a single life, that it is reasonable to suppose that a person brings certain dispositions, such as talents, with him through birth, and that one can accept that the soul may have existed before entering physical life. But all this remains only a daring hypothesis. For modern research of the soul, everything of this kind continues to be unsatisfactory, insofar as this research pursues a path that seemingly aims quite conscientiously toward an ideal. One can characterize what is going on here in the following way. Anyone who considers human life without prejudice, with all the passions that engulf it, its shades of feeling, its inclination toward ideas of whatever kind, will, if he has at least a certain relationship to the standpoint of spiritual science, say, we have, as a result of our education, achieved many things, but not everything can be explained by this. For we bring, through the portal of birth, something that derives from previous stages of earthly existence. However, the serious-minded scientist may counter. Have we not made a beginning by investigating the early part of childhood, that part of early childhood of which we later have no recollection? A modern naturalist or philosopher will then perhaps say, the spirit researcher is wanting to suggest that a gifted genius, for example Feuerbach, brought certain powers with him from his previous life, and was thereby enabled to work artistically. But the following discovery has now been made. Such an artist paints with a quite distinctive mood of color, prefers a particular facial expression, and has other features that lead in a particular direction. If one looks further, one finds that in his early childhood, he saw, for example, a bust in his room, and that the particular way that the light always fell on it impressed itself on the soul of the child. This emerges again later, and it comes to be seen, so it is said, that such impressions are deeply influential and significant. It is possible to explain a great deal in this way. Spiritual science wants to lead everything back to past earthly lives, whereas through careful observation and investigation of early childhood, one can perhaps explain everything. One can then make